Right now we are starting off at number 10 and we have The Gas Man. This one comes from Ligamentary. She said when she was 12 she was left home alone with her sister for the weekend. One night she was waiting for her friend for a sleepover when there was a knock at the door. It was a man with a clipboard who wanted to check the gas meter. She was disappointed that it wasn't her friend and simply said, "Yeah, sure, whatever you need to do." She didn't notice at the time but the man wasn't wearing an official uniform. He had on a green and purple shirt with bold stripes. He went right upstairs into her room. At that moment her sister came downstairs and asked who was that at the door. She said it was the gas man and that her friend still wasn't there yet, but just as she began complaining her sister's face turned white and she cut her off. She dragged her outside and said, "Our gas meters are outside." Her sister had a stroke of genius. She called out to a man walking by and said, "Oh Dad, it's good you're home. A man from the city is here to read the gas meters upstairs." Naturally the man asked, "What are you talking about?" At that moment the man in the striped shirt bolted out of the house. 3 weeks later a girl in the community went missing. She was also home alone and police found no signs of forced entry. The girls had kept quiet until now about their experience but knew they had to come forward and help. They told their parents and the police what happened to them. The police said it was probably the same man they were after. A while later they found the missing girl. She had been held for days and then burned alive. They never forgot what happened and what a close call it really was. Next up at number 9 now we have The Boy. Can6101 said that as a kid she moved to the town of Gilbert, Arizona when it was quickly becoming a city. Her house used to just be farmland. She was the oldest of 7 kids so the house was always noisy. At night though it seemed to creak even though it was totally new. One night her sister had friends over for a sleepover. The conversation quickly turned to ghost stories in their bedroom. They were mainly just joking around but then they heard something outside of their room. Her sister and her friends were a year younger so it was on her to go and check. She crept down the hallway which opened up into the stairway. She looked down into the living room. The lights had been turned on. Strange. As she went down the steps she noticed the back door was open and someone had walked mud into the house. She froze. Her heart began beating fast. The mud tracks zigzagged all over the floor and seemed to stop right near her. She ran back to get the others and when she returned the scene looked the exact same except for one difference. There, standing by the back door, was a small boy. He was wearing nothing but overalls, covered in mud and was giving them a sad look. Then he was gone, vanished into thin air. The door slowly closed. They silently screamed back to their room, convinced that they had just seen the ghost of the farmer's son whose land the house was built on. It was a hot summer in Arizona and there was no rain to make mud. At number 8 now we have The Pills. Winter Minute Rising said that as a girl she was at a sleepover at a boy's house. They stayed up watching videos and then she went to sleep on the couch. Late at night she was woken up to the sound of his dad slamming into the wall. He started screaming for his wife to bring him his pills. He screamed louder and louder. She squeezed her eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. Before long he was screaming right in front of the couch. She still didn't react. He grabbed her by the hair, wrenched her head back and put a gun to her face. His eyes were crazed. He screamed for his pills again. All of a sudden he stopped and muttered, "I thought you were my wife." He then stumbled off to another part of the house, gun in hand. She said that her and the guy's mother had a similar shade and length of hair. She never mentioned it or slept at that guy's house again. Next up at number 7 now we have The Reflection. This one comes from user DarkSecret2277. He said that when he was 7 years old his best friend Tony came for a sleepover. Around midnight he pulled out the sofa and they watched some TV together. At one point he looked out into his yard which was bathed in moonlight. To his horror he saw a figure standing outside. It was human-like and totally orange. The figure started walking towards him. His heart was beating fast. He tried blinking but it was still there. As he got closer he could see its features more clearly. It had no face and its body was slightly see-through. He quickly closed the curtains. His hands were sweating and shaking. He opened the curtains and the creature was gone. He thought it might have been the reflection of the TV, but what he saw didn't add up with that. Moving on to number 6 now, we have The Drums. This one comes from user Tatvamu. He said that as a kid in Aspen he went on a wilderness youth camp where they slept over. They made camp near a place called War Woman Dell. It was beautiful but the whole place just felt off. There were about 15 of them sleeping in groups of 3 with 2 staff members taking turns on night shift with a headlamp. He kept hearing this faint rhythm in the distance and asked the girl next to him if she heard anything too. At first she said no, but then it got louder and closer. The staff member outside shouted shouted at them that it was time to sleep and knock it off, but the drumming kept getting louder. At this point, they were all in their tents, looking at each other. Some of them started crying. Who was drumming? The drums continued till dawn and then stopped when the sun came up. They quickly got out of there and ate their breakfast on the trail. As an adult, he says that he kind of wants to return now and see if the drums still play at night. Next up at number 5 now, we have the chain. This story is part of a chain letter that was circling around a few years ago, and it fits our video quite well. There were once 5 girls who had a sleepover club. Every Saturday, they would have a slumber party at one of the girls' houses. One night, when the girl was having a sleepover, they heard loud noises and screaming outside. It seemed to be coming from the end of the street. They went down to find out what was happening. They learned that a woman had been murdered, and the man who killed her was still on the loose. They ran home, terrified, and locked all the doors. Strange noises got louder until they became unbearable. Their imaginations ran wild, and they thought the killer was coming for them. Gripped by terror, they hid inside a closet and waited. They heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They held their breath, afraid to make a sound. Suddenly, the closet door opened, and a man was stood there. They screamed and ran in different directions. 4 of the girls locked themselves in the basement. The 5th one was skinned alive in the bathroom. The bathroom was right above the basement, and the others were forced to listen to the sound of their friend being murdered. In the morning, the man had fled, and the girls came out of the basement. They went to the bathroom, and there, written in blood, was a final message from their friend. "How could you have let me die?" This story was part of a chain that said if you don't share it, he will come for you too. Don't worry though, guys. It's just a chain letter. Next up at number 4 now, we have the haunted house. This one comes from a girl who said she went to a sleepover at her friend's house for her birthday. Her name was Jackie. Jackie lived in a big creepy house in the woods. She didn't like that and thought she should just leave right there and then. She thought not, but would later live to regret that. The house had a big glass living room facing out into the woods. They kept thinking they could see things darting between the trees. The birthday cake seemed to blow itself out. When Jackie opened her presents, all of them stared at a spot in the room for seemingly no reason. They all just felt something was there. One girl left as she felt it was dangerous. They went to bed in the living room. While in their sleeping bags, they saw a red light in front of them. They couldn't tell where it was coming from though. Although they were terrified by this point, they somehow managed to get to sleep. When they woke up, it was bright, and it seemed like the terror was over. They went outside to a tree in the yard with a rope there for climbing. She climbed onto the rope, and immediately the wind began blowing, and she clearly heard someone call her name from the woods. As she listened, the voice said to stop because she could get hurt. When she jumped off, the wind stopped. None of her friends heard it. Then one of her friends, a girl called Michelle, suddenly had a vision of someone hanging from that tree. They got away from it fast. Michelle felt an invisible foot kick her at the level it would be at if someone was hanging above them. They ran to the parents, who could see how terrified they were, and agreed to take them home. Next up at number 3 now, we have Ginny's house. This one comes from Reddit user Requiemen. She said that when she was in elementary school, she had a group of friends. Ginny was her best friend. They went to her sleepover at her house for the first time. She'd always tried to brush them off and make excuses for why they couldn't come, but one day she finally agreed. They thought she was embarrassed about her house, but when they arrived, they could see from the outside it looked really nice. The outside had a front lawn that was well decorated with flowers. They even had a real picket fence. They asked Jenny if she was secretly rich, and she just laughed. The inside was nice too, but very bare. There was almost no furniture, and the walls looked like they'd never been touched. The floor was uncomfortably clean. The house had a sickly sweet smell of scented candles. Her parents brought them to the living room. It was huge, about 3 times the size of hers, but again, it was almost empty, just a few couches and a rug. They sat on the leather sofa, which had a brand new chemical smell to it. Then Ginny's parents handed them pizza on paper plates. They tried to entertain them with jokes, but it felt awkward. The whole time, Ginny said nothing. She was usually cheerful, but seemed stiff and nervous in front of her parents. Her parents left, and with no TV screen, the girls played cards. She wanted to go to the bathroom, so asked Ginny where it was. Strangely, Ginny ran out of the room to ask for her parents' permission. She heard her talking nervously with her parents. Then Ginny's mother told her to follow her. She opened the door. There was a set of stairs leading up to a second floor. She said it was up there and she would walk her there. She opened the bathroom door, and inside there was nothing besides a sink and a toilet. After using it, they all went to bed. They slept in the living room without even seeing Ginny's room. She remembered waking up in the middle of the night and seeing Ginny moving around. The next morning, even after 8 hours of sleep, she felt so tired. When she went home, the family doctor was called to the house but found nothing obviously wrong with her. People in the comments section of this story think Ginny and her family were vampires who sucked their blood, and that's why they didn't have any needs for anything except accept the basics in life. What do you guys think of that? Next up at number 2 now, we have the mobile home. This one isn't a myth, rumor or legend. It was a tragedy that happened in 2013. A fire swept through a mobile home in the town of Sherrard, Illinois. It killed 5 people. 4 of them were children having a sleepover. The victims of the blaze included an adult woman. The oldest child killed was 15 years old. The fire was reported around 1 a.m. and happened just outside of Sherrard, which is located 180 miles west of Chicago. Investigators sorted through the ruins after the fire, being careful to not disturb the remains for clues as to what sparked the blaze that reduced its structure to its steel frame. And finally, number 1 now, we have Slender Man. In January 2018, Morgan Geiser and Anissa Weir were sentenced for stabbing a classmate 19 times in order to, in their account, appease Slenderman. Fortunately, the classmate survived. She was lured out into the woods during a sleepover. All 3 girls were 12 years old at the time. That's when Morgan and Anissa attacked the victim. They believed that if they didn't do this, Slenderman would kill their families. Both girls were charged as adults with first-degree attempted murder, but found not responsible for their actions due to mental illness. The county circuit judge said institutional care was required because Morgan presented a risk and needed intensive monitoring. She broke down in tears in court, saying, "I never meant for it to happen." Starting off at number 10 now, we have the camera. This one comes from user I Happen to Disagree. They said that when they were about 14, 3 of his friends were having a sleepover. For the purposes of this story, he called them A, B and C. They were staying at A's house. Now A lived with his grandfather after his mother and grandmother passed away from cancer. That night his grandfather was out of town. The group stayed up playing video games and then crashed at about 2 a.m. on the floor in the living room. Later that night he woke up freezing cold. He checked the time. It was 4:30. He looked around and saw a red blinking light over on a coffee table. He made a mental note about the light seeming out of place, but he was cold and too tired to get up, so he rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning he was woken up by A shaking him violently. He opened his eyes and could tell by his face something was wrong. He tried to ask him what was going on, but he just pointed at the coffee table. On the table was his grandma's old camera. He told him it hadn't been out of his grandma's drawer since she died. Who took it out? They tried to calm themselves down by saying it must have been his granddad, who was getting nostalgic perhaps. Friends B and C seemed okay with that, but A had his doubts. A week went by and they had pretty much forgotten about the strange morning, except for A, who had been stressing out ever since. He decided to go and get the film on the pictures developed. He called them the next day. His voice was trembling and he told them to all come over quick. When they arrived, he threw down the pictures in front of them. There was a bunch of holiday snaps from the last trip that his grandmother went on, but when they got to the last 3 pictures, they froze. The pictures were of all of them asleep on the living room floor in front of the TV. Nobody else was home that night. The camera had no self-timer. None of them have ever figured out what happened, and it still sends a chill down their spines. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the stalker. This one comes from Reddit user A Platinum Gamer. He said when he was 13, he and a few friends were heading over to their friend John's house for a sleepover. About halfway along their journey, in a rougher part of town, they noticed a man in a dark jacket walking behind them. It was getting dark and cold. The further they walked, the more he seemed to follow them. Despite taking a different route home to try and lose him, still he followed. 10 minutes went by. They reached the end of John's street. The man slowed down. They rushed into the house. Okay, but shaken up. Later on, John's mother and brother left the house, leaving the boys alone. They sat on a couch watching movies. He got up to get a drink from the fridge. When he closed the door, he glanced at the window and thought he saw someone standing outside the front of the house. It was dark outside though, so it was hard to know for sure. He sat down. About 20 minutes later, he glanced at the window again. This time, there was no mistake. He saw a man standing outside, the man who followed them home. He calmly looked back to the TV, hoping to not give anything away. He quietly told his friends that there was a man outside, but not to look. John looked. They all freaked out. John called his brother, who said he would come back right away. They hid in the living room until he came back. They searched around the whole house but found no one. Perhaps the scariest part is that apparently this wasn't the last time they saw him either, but perhaps that's a story for another day. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the serial killer.
This story was told by a Reddit user who said that when she was a kid, she shared a room with her sister. One night, they had one of their friends over for a sleepover. As they fell asleep around 1 AM, their friend woke them up to show them that a deer was on their back deck. Now they were in Montana. This was quite a normal sight. They didn't really want to see it and they fell asleep again. Their friend stayed up though to watch. She woke them up again about 5 minutes later to say that actually she thinks it's a person. They looked again and saw the shadow move. She was right. It was definitely a man. They started freaking out. They saw 2 green laser lights. They were small pinpoint lights that seemed to come from the man's head area. He was looking into their kitchen window. She was too scared to tell her parents or move, so they rang their home phone. It rang loudly and the man took off. The cops were called out but never found the guy. They did tell them something though. 2 weeks earlier, the police had sent around notices warning of a dangerous sexual predator on the loose. Some thought that he was staying with a family member just 3 streets away from their house. A few months later, that man was caught by police for the kidnapping, abuse and murder of 2 children about a 2-hour drive away. In his police interrogation, he confessed to stalking kids by watching their homes at night. He used night vision goggles with green lights on them. Let's say no more on that one. Next up at number 7 now we have the knocking. This one came from a Reddit user who said that he had a sleepover as a kid with his friend Mike. It was a cloudy dark night. There was a bit of rain and an occasional crackle of thunder. They were 13 years old. Mike lived opposite a field surrounded by trees and his backyard led to a forest. He and Mike were playing long after his dad went to sleep. While playing video games they heard a knock at the back door. The blinds were shut so they couldn't see outside. Mike opened the blinds. As he did, he shut off the TV and lamp because he didn't want them to be seen. Their eyes adjusted to the outside. They could see nothing but grass lit up every few moments by lightning. They waited with bated breath. They kept their eyes glued to the window, half expecting a figure to emerge from the darkness. Eventually they turned the TV and lamp back on, trying to pretend that they'd imagined the knocking. The blinds were open this time. Every now and again he would take a nervous glance at them. At one point, as they were engrossed in their game, they heard a second set of knocks. He and Mike jumped up and looked at each other. They couldn't really see outside, at least not until the flash of lightning that lit up the area outside, only for a split second, but long enough to show a person standing at the window. They ran. They ran upstairs to Mike's dad, screaming at him to get up. The 3 of them then ran out to the backyard, but they found nobody. In the piles of wet mud they found heavy, distinct prints of boots. They followed the footprints but they eventually disappeared. They looked out into the woods but there was nothing. They all went back to bed. He and Mike were sleeping in the living room. Of course, he couldn't sleep now, even with the blinds shut. Then at exactly 12:15 there was a 3rd set of knocks. They ran upstairs again. This time the dad ran outside alone and told them to call the cops. The police came but found nobody either. The knocking didn't happen again, but that was more than enough for a lifetime. He never slept over at Mike's again. The thought of it has always given him the creeps. At number 6 now we have Janice's mother. This one comes from Reddit user Susie Greenberg. Now Susie said that when she was 10 years old she went for a sleepover at her friend Janice's house. They hadn't been friends for long but her parents were quite laid back so they let her go and stay there. She was dropped off and soon they were singing karaoke. Janice's mum said that she had to leave and so the pair were left alone for the night. They had a great time and ended up going to bed in Janice's room around 1 AM. A few hours later Janice's mum came home. She started banging on the bedroom door, causing Susie to call out in fear. Janice told her to be quiet, but it was too late. The mum kicked the door open and grabbed Janice's face. She began screaming at Janice because she apparently left the TV on. She began slamming her fists around Susie and screaming, "You think you're better than me?" over and over again. Susie was sobbing and scared. She asked to use the phone so her mum could come pick her up, but Janice's mum refused, saying, "I know what you're doing, little girl, and you aren't going anywhere until I say you can." She barely slept that night. The next morning she managed to get hold of the phone while the mum was in the shower. Her own mum came and picked her up but she was too scared to say anything. It wasn't until 2 weeks later when she told her sister. She told their parents and they all comforted her. A few weeks later Janice stopped coming to the school. It wasn't until years later that she realised that Janice's mum must have had deep rooted issues, ones that a child might struggle to comprehend. Moving on to number 5 now we have the cellar door. This is another one submitted to Mr. Nightmare. The user said that they used to be friends with a kid named Chris. Chris moved away across the state when he was 8. Since he never got to see Chris anymore, he got his mum to drive him out to Chris's new house way out in the country. When he arrived, he was impressed. It was a big house surrounded by woods in all directions. They watched a movie that night and chatted. Sometimes he thought he'd hear noises coming from below the house. He asked Chris if he had a basement. Chris said no, but said his family had all heard the same noises over the past few days and that they were calling out someone to inspect it. The next day was warm. They spent the day outside and went for a walk in the woods. They followed what looked like a path. Suddenly, Chris tripped over something that made a clank. They looked down and saw a covered up cellar door, which Chris said he wasn't even aware of. They opened it up. A ladder led down to a pitch black tunnel. Both of them froze. Then a sound roared up the tunnel, a bang and then a metallic clanging getting closer and closer. They realized it was the sound of someone climbing up the ladder. They ran in fear and fetched Chris's dad. He too was shocked by what he found. His dad gathered a few friends and they went down to investigate. They came up about 5 minutes later. Every one of them looked shaken. They had a secret meeting with Chris's mum and didn't let the boys hear anything. The police arrived soon after. They were forced to stay in their rooms. It wasn't until years later when Chris found out exactly what happened that he finally texted him. His dad had found 3 full body bags in a corner of a dark room, an old cot, broken beer bottles everywhere, and the smell of freshly smoked marijuana. When they heard the sounds coming from below the house, they had probably heard the sound of whoever was living down there and whoever was responsible for the dead bodies. At number 4 now we have the giggles. This one comes from Katie the Magnificent. Now she said that when she was a kid, her best friend came over for a sleepover. They hung out in her room watching videos on their computer. They were laughing hard, but noticed when they stopped laughing, they could still hear muffled laughter coming from outside. Her friend Beth paused the video. Katie thought it was her big brother. She shouted for him to go to bed. Footsteps went down the stairs. She grabbed her phone to text him, but as she did, she saw that she actually was missing a few texts from him. The first one said, "Mom said stay in the house at night, dumbass." The next one said, "Can you stop banging around upstairs? Some of us actually sleep." The last one said, "Thanks. There's Sprite in the fridge, by the way." Katie was spooked. They never left the house and they were in their room well before those texts were sent. She called him. He said, "This better be good." She explained what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Open your window, get onto the roof, take your phones and go across to Dr. Tom's house, call the police on your way out, and after that call mum. And remember, I love you and I love mum and dad. A lot, okay? Go now." Katie was crying as she pushed Beth out onto the roof. They called the police as they escaped their neighbours, Dr. Tom. When he heard what happened, he grabbed his gun and went over. When the police arrived, the girls were filled in on the details. Her brother had fought the intruder with a baseball bat. The intruder surrendered when Dr. Tom came in with a gun. Everyone praised the brothers' quick thinking and bravery, and they were left wondering how the intruder got in the first place. Next up at number 3 now we have hide and seek. This user submitted his story to Mr. Nightmare. He said he and his cousin Tyler used to have sleepovers all the time when they were kids. It was always at his house though because he had the cool house. One time when they were 9, both of their parents were going out for a night, so they had Tyler's older brother Joe taking care of them. An hour into it, Joe told both of them that he was going out and not to tell their parents. Tyler was happy to have the place to himself and Joe got to go out for the night. He and Tyler had some food and then decided to play hide and seek. He hid first. Tyler was seeking. They started in the basement where Tyler would count. There was only one rule: only use flashlights, no house lights, just to add some suspense. He ran all the way to the upstairs of the house. He chose to hide in one of the bedrooms and buried himself between 2 big beanbag chairs and a blanket. He left the door open to avoid any suspicions. He heard creaking coming into the room. Tyler was looking for him. He opened the closet. Nothing. Then the second closet. Silence. Then he walked over to the other side of the room and started opening the desk drawers. Suddenly he heard Tyler's voice, but it wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from the bottom of the stairs. His mouth opened in horror. He lifted the blanket and saw a figure standing there, a fully grown man. The man ducked into the corner of the room when he heard Tyler's voice. Tyler entered the room with his flashlight and kept saying his name over and over. He was praying his light wouldn't reach the corner of the room. His light landed on him underneath a blanket. He might not have actually seen him, but he still jumped up anyway and kind of fake laughed, telling Tyler that he won. He put his arm around Tyler and guided him down the stairs. That's when he told him there was someone in the room room with him and nudged him to run outside. They ran next door and asked the woman living there to call the police. The police arrived and dragged the man out in cuffs. They were terrified and relieved in equal measure. Next up at number 2 now, we have the walls. This one comes from Reddit user Helena Marlena. Now she said that her friend Celia always used to invite her over when they were little. Celia pointed out that a hole was forming in the wall of her unfinished basement. Her parents weren't worried. As the years went by, the hole seemed to be getting bigger. They could now put their arms through it. It wasn't any wider, just deeper. At this point, Celia also told Helena that she could hear voices from her basement and that she believed it was coming from the hole. Helena never heard these sounds, but she believed her. They often had sleepovers where Celia said she could hear the voices. They would go down to the basement to find one of their many pets just standing in front of the hole, staring. Celia said she was beginning to think something lived in the walls of the house and used this hole as a sort of way to get out. She was an anxious wreck at school. Only Helena knew why. One night she was sleeping over in Celia's room. She had a huge collection of stuffed animals. In the morning, they woke up to see every stuffed animal had been perfectly arranged into a pile about 4 feet high. All of them were facing them. Some of them were on top of large wardrobes. The next night they woke up around the same time when it was still dark. They heard a low creaking noise from below the bed. They peered under and heard one floorboard slam back onto the ground. They shot their heads back up and cried. Helena said she had never been so scared in her life and called her parents the very next morning to take her home. She refused to ever go back to Celia's house. Either way, Helena's family moved away from that place, and years on she still wondered if Celia and her family still lived in that house and what exactly was wrong with it. And finally, at number 1 now, we have Kiko. This one comes from a Reddit user called Killer Orange Cat. It's set in Osaka in Japan, where the user comes from originally. Her friend was called Kiko. Kiko's father worked in Tokyo and was never home. Her mother was a nurse who worked overnight. Kiko really didn't like being alone in her house at night, so sleepovers were common. Her parents let her stay with her most nights. One night she and Kiko were staying in the living room watching television. Early in the night they heard a knock at Kiko's door. They weren't expecting anyone, so Kiko didn't get up right away. However, when the knock came again, she got up and went to look through the window. No one was at the door. They immediately thought it was just kids pulling a prank. Less than 5 minutes later though, there was another knock at the door. Just like before, they looked out and saw nobody. As they walked back to the couch, the knock came again. There really was nobody outside. As they went to the door to see who was stood outside, the knock came again, louder and faster than ever. It got faster and faster and faster. They were paralyzed with fear. Just as they thought it was all over, they heard a voice at the door. It said, "Kiko, this is your Aunt Uni. Open the door." The voice was cold, strained, and didn't sound like her aunt. That didn't matter anyway, as the aunt had actually died years before. They looked at each other in absolute horror, then quickly shut themselves in their room for the rest of the night. They couldn't hear the knocking or the voices anymore, but the memory has stayed with them forever. Starting off at number 10 now, we have Beep. This one comes from Reddit user Jenna Dorazio. She said that she was watching her friend's house one day while she and her family were on vacation. Her elderly grandma lived in the house too. She stayed up watching TV late, so she decided to just sleep over. She called her boyfriend at the time to talk before bed from the house phone. Now during that call, a beep sound would happen every so often. It sounded like someone was on the other phone in the house and just pressing a button over and over again. She kept asking her boyfriend if he heard that same beep. He didn't though. Then another call came through and she clicked over and the voice from the other end said the word beep, and then just hung up. She freaked out, called her dad, who lived up the road, to come and stay the night because she feared for her life. To this day, she said it was the creepiest thing ever. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the knife. This one comes from Reddit user Apot27. Now she said when she was about 13, her parents went camping along with her aunt and uncle. She wasn't a big fan of camping though, and so was allowed to stay at home with her cousin. They had some friends over too, Whitney, Mary and Monique. They did a typical sleepover stuff, ate junk food, watched movies, gossiped about boys, that sort of thing. For some reason, they thought it would be a good idea to have a seance, like you do. They set it up in her cousin's bedroom at the front of the house and began. Her cousin and 2 of her friends began to scare the 3rd friend, Monique. They laughed it off though. A while later, they had forgotten about the scary game and continued joking around. She fell asleep that night and was awoken by the sound of the other 4 girls screaming. She jumped out of bed and the girls said Whitney was acting strange. They said she was making unearthly sounds and wielding a knife. They all scrambled to the front door, which was Martina's bedroom, bedroom and then rushed out of the door and into the light of sunrise. They ran down the street with Whitney chasing them, slashing the knife in the air. Eventually they ducked into a post office and lay flat on the floor. They could hear Whitney calling out to them as she stepped on the gravel road outside. Eventually she left them alone though, and the girls were able to get help. To this day, they still believe Whitney was affected by their little seance session. Next up at number 8 now, we have The Fright. This one comes from Reddit user Torvan. Now she said that when she was 15, she and some friends were having a sleepover. One of her friends, Steph, was always very rough with the other girls. That night, she, Steph and the other girls began chasing each other just as a bit of fun. Soon though, Steph got too rough and tackled her to the ground and pinned her there. She was genuinely a bit scared, and the other girls started to notice that it was a little bit too close for comfort. They grabbed Steph's limbs, tying her arms behind her and her legs together. It took 20 minutes because she was strong and struggled. When they had succeeded, they proceeded to watch some TV. Somehow though, she escaped. They ran upstairs, 3 girls got to the bedroom and she ran to the bathroom. She locked herself inside and Steph started banging on the door. She didn't know how long she was in there for, but the sun eventually came up and she spent the whole night in the bathtub. Not sure how I feel about that one. I mean, sure, her friend sounds pretty scary, but tying them up and just leaving them? A little bit weird. Next up at number 7 now guys, we have The Mirror. We've got some long ones in this video, so here's a nice little short and sweet one to balance it out. This one comes from Chemical Robot. Now he says that one night he and his little brother slept in his sister's room on her floor. When they woke up the next morning, the mirror from her bedroom wall had been taken off the wall and was now between him and his brother. He woke up staring at his own reflection. Can you even imagine how unnerving that would be first thing in the morning? Nobody in the house knew how it happened or even how someone could do that without one of them waking up. He said he still gets chills when he thinks about that stuff that he, his friends and family saw in that house. This includes the ghost of an old man who was seen 3 times in his bedroom, once by himself. Perhaps he was the one who moved the mirror. Moving on to number 6 now, we have The Shadow. This one was told by Starlight Dreams. She said that one night as a kid she had a sleepover where they set it up in the living room. Immediately she felt like they were just being watched. They went to one of the girls' houses to get some stuff. It was very dark by this point and she lived quite far away. They felt like something was following them the entire way, but it always ended up being something like a car going past. As they approached their friend's house, they heard a scream, a banshee-like scream that pierced the night air. At the side of the road, they saw a shadow run into the forest. They grabbed their friend's stuff and began walking very quickly back to the house. Now they really felt like someone was following them. When they got back, they tried to forget about it, just have some pizza, watch some TV. Suddenly though, the lights went out. They all started screaming. Everyone fell on the bed as a shadow entered the kitchen. One of them tried to grab the flashlight, but before she could, the shadow just disappeared. They kept seeing it as they tried to get to sleep, dancing around the room. In the end, they all fell asleep watching it as a calm feeling washed over them, almost as if it was casting a spell on them. We have the Ouija. This one comes from Reddit user Krull. Now he said he was told this one by his mum. When she was a teenager, she slept over at a friend's house. They were up playing games while the parents watched TV. She and her friends were on the floor playing a board game. It turned out to be a Ouija board. She didn't know what it was though at the time. When they started asking the board questions, they ended up finding out that there was a spirit in the house and they asked it to show itself. Nothing happened. They demanded that the spirit show itself. This time, all the lights in the house went out. The TV, the lamps, everything just blinked off. A second later, they came back on again. They asked the Ouija board, "Who are you?" The piece moved around the board in big circles and began to spell out the letters D-E-V-I-L. This can't be real, they thought. They asked the devil to show itself. After a few moments, the TV just goes out. In the reflection of the TV, sitting in the living room next to them was the shape of something dark, sitting right next to them. The house went cold, so cold. They stopped the game immediately and never looked back. Next up at number 4 now, we have the Sandwich. This one comes from Reddit user Necronym. She said that when she was around 11 or 12, she lived with her grandparents. They were always away for their anniversary, and so she was allowed to have a friend over for the weekend. They trusted him enough to not give him a babysitter. This was quite a lot of trust, seeing as they lived way out in the mountains. Their closest neighbor was about a mile away. That night, she and her friends were playing Guitar Hero at about midnight when they heard noises coming from the kitchen. They presumed it was just the cats messing around and ignored it at first. A few minutes later though, the noise happened again, and this time it was louder. It sounded like jars clanking and silverware bashing together. They both walked into the hallway and could see that there was someone in the kitchen. There was the shadow figure of a man standing in front of the fridge. They looked at each other, not quite sure what to do. The man was in between them and the phone. Then her friend just spoke up and calmly said, "Hey, "Who are you?" She said it so calmly that it scared the man. He dropped all of the stuff he had in his arms and ran straight out of the house and into the darkness. They called the police. It turns out the strange man had been making a sandwich in the fridge, and the police never figured out who he was. Moving on to number 3 now, we have Freedom. This one comes from Mount Lover Girl. She said that when she was younger, her friend invited her to a birthday sleepover with 3 other mutual friends. The 5 of them were messing around, having fun, sharing ghost stories, some of them real, some of them not. One of the girls, Jodie, began telling her story, and at that moment there was a bang at the door. They were all scared because the parents of the house had gone out for the night, so they were home alone. They decided to lock all the doors and windows and then meet back in the room they slept in. Jodie didn't come back though, and when they returned, they found that a window in the room was open. They assumed Jodie just went out to try and scare them. If that was true, it was working. They checked out the window and no one was out there, so they locked it. They checked the whole house downstairs and then they heard screeching. They went into the room that they thought it was coming from, and there was Jodie trying to shut a window that screeched when it grinded along the bottom. When they all tried to shut it though, nothing happened. Suddenly the bang on the door happened again. When they opened it though, nobody was there. Must just have been a tree branch banging in the wind. Just as the door closed though, they heard a whisper, very low but very clear. It said, "Let me be free." They froze. They ran to their beds and rarely spoke of that night again. Next up at number 2 now, we have Light as a Feather. This is a story from D Taylor85. She told it like this: "The story took place when I was about 14. I'm 22 now and the memory still scares the crap out of me. My friend had a huge slumber party for her birthday. Her house was very old and was rumored to once be part of the Underground Railroad. Her attic was a series of rooms that mirrored her downstairs, except for one that had a hole cut out of the floor. It looked like a tunnel led from it and went about 3 feet back before it was blocked off with rubble and bricks. She would always tell us stories of weird stuff that happened in her house. Her room had the stairs to the attic attached to it, and she would hear sounds coming from up there like people walking around. And once her electric keyboard that was up there just went off on its own. It was playing Oh Susanna on repeat, which is kind of strange because her name is Susan. We, being a bunch of teenage girls, decided to play that silly game, light as a feather, stiff as a board. We were all sitting around in a circle with candles concentrating on getting this girl to float when the stuff hit the fan, so to speak. All at once the room we were in dropped in temperature and the candles all flicked on at once like there was a breeze in the room, which there wasn't. We all screamed and jumped up. We all piled on her couch. There were at least 10 of us, so you can imagine. That's when we heard a loud boom come from the coat closet connected to the room we were sitting in. Almost at the same second, a dark shadow ran around the wrap around the porch. We watched it move through the windows, and at one point it passed right by where we were all sitting. We didn't hear the sound of anyone running through, which was odd. It stopped at the front door, and that's when we realized the door wasn't locked. Not that it would have really mattered. But still, I decided to be the brave one and jumped up and ran and locked the door. When I did this, I could clearly see out of the window and no one was there. Human, at least. I flicked on the light on the back of the couch and slowly we got our nerves back. Eventually, we opened the door to the coat room and saw that her coat rack had been knocked over by something. None of us slept that night, and needless to say, I never spent the night at her house again. And finally, at number 1 now, we have the Creeper. This one came from JS Child, who told it like this: "One night my sisters had a slumber party. I was probably like 6 or 8 then. They were all up watching TV in our living room. Our living room is fully open and had a dining room at one end with only a couch separating the 2 areas. Besides the dining room was a big sliding glass door that led to our deck. Well, I've been harassing my sisters and their friends, bugging them. They were all 5 to 7 years older than me while they watched TV. When I went into the kitchen and got a drink, the lights were all out in the rooms, just the TV on, but the outside deck had a light on. As I walked back from the kitchen into the dining room, I saw a large man standing on our back deck. Just standing there, not walking around. I didn't think he could see us. The curtain was drawn, but there must have been a gap in the curtains he could see in through. I just froze there for a second, terrified. Then I walked fast to my oldest sister and told her someone is watching us. At first she thinks I'm joking, but I got her and one of her friends to look at the sliding glass doors. We all instantly freaked out and then bolted to the back bedroom where my dad is, and we woke him up. He went outside and saw the footprints in the snow, but we still don't know who the creeper was watching us on our back deck."